Anna Siefken. I'm the Executive Director for the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. There are about 150 people at Carnegie Mellon who are working on energy-related research. We're going to talk more about that when we do our formal introductions, which will come around 12 noon. But first, we have a very important speaker who's joined us. I am thrilled to introduce Jay Hakes. Jay is the former administrator of the highly respected U.S. Energy Information Administrator and author of the book, A Declaration of Energy Independence: How Freedom from Foreign Oil Can Improve National Security, Our Economy, and the Environment. During his career in government, he held numerous positions dealing with energy: Assistant to the Secretary of the Interior, Director of the Florida Governor's Energy Office, Head of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and he also served for 13 years as Director of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta. He stays current on developments across the world of energy, writing regularly for Real Clear Energy, and recently testified before the Energy Appropriations Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives on national priorities in energy technology. So please join me in welcoming Jay Hakes.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here at one of our nation's great centers of learning. I spent some of my youth in Pittsburgh, so it's kind of nice to be back. I'm going to start with a test. This is, after all, a university. I hope this is an easy question, but how many of you know who Guy Stever is? Okay, a few people. Guy Stever was the president of Carnegie Mellon University from 1965 to 1972. That's his memoir. I took a picture of it because it's in on the shelf in my office at home. And why is it there? Well, he's pretty important for reasons not just because he was president of Carnegie Mellon, although that's pretty good in and of itself. But he left the university to become head of the National Academy of Sciences. And it just so happened that when he left in 1973 was the year that Richard Nixon abolished the White House Science Office. So the plan was that the National Academy of Sciences would operate as sort of a de facto White House Science Office, which put Stever in a very important position. Now, in 1975, he oversaw a new pioneering report by the National Academy of Sciences called Understanding Climate Change. It was a big, hefty book. It was a survey of what we knew about climate change in 1975 and what we needed to know to fill the gaps. That book also sits on a shelf in my office. Shortly thereafter, President Ford reestablished the White House Science Office and named Stever as its head. So he was the first head of the White House Science Office that was authorized under federal legislation. The ones before had been voluntary. And then he came by, he'd been operating at a very high level, but he came back in 1992 to help write the National Academy of Sciences program report, Policy Implications of Global Warming, another important milestone in climate science. Now, why do I mention him? One is I follow Edmund Burke, who said we should always remember those who came before us and build a world for those who come after. Stever, I think, kind of fits into that category. But it also establishes a time frame. There are a lot of people who say, well, we need to start studying climate science, or we need to start developing policies to deal with climate change. The first major White House report on climate change came out in 1965. That one was only about 70 pages. And then the Academy came out in 75. So in both climate science and energy, timeframes are very important. Speaking of timeframes, I'd like to point out that we are currently in the greatest period of change in the history of energy. There's nothing before that's ever come close to this. Natural gas production in the last 12 years is up 45%, oil production 115%, wind production 660%, solar production up almost 1,400%. We've slashed our oil imports from 60% to, last I checked, was 13% of net imports when you subtract the exports from imports. Now, not only are these numbers fairly astounding, they're pretty much unexpected by most energy experts if you go back a dozen years. My book that Anna mentioned came out in 2008, and I suggested that it would be a good idea to slash our oil imports from 60% to maybe 25 or 30%. I was called Pollyannish, didn't understand energy, there was no way that imports were coming down. Here we are, 13%. I was too negative. But one point I want to make today, as I've been involved in energy for a long time, and I'd like to point out that the seeds of the current revolution were planted a long time ago, mainly in the 1970s. This is a picture of Jimmy Carter on the roof of the White House in June of 1979, dedicating 32 thermal solar panels. And these are the old-fashioned solar panels. They have glycerin running through the pipe, getting hot, and then it goes down to a heat exchanger and it heats your water. And when the sun's not up, you use a resistance hot water to heat it. So it's not actually even all that energy efficient. But anyhow, it was part of a larger program to put in tax incentives for solar, to do R&D in the advanced photovoltaic panels, which were a whole different technology, and a solar bank. And he set as a goal that the United States would achieve 20% of its electricity from renewable energy by the year 2000. And we're not quite there yet. But he said either this will be a new revolution for the United States or these panels will end up in a museum somewhere. Well, one of these panels actually is on display at the Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta. So what happened to bring us to where we are today? At a research university, you certainly will not neglect the role of research and development. It is the foundation for what happens. And I find, if you're not familiar with this bar graph, I would become familiar with it because the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences puts it out every year. And it's the non-defense research and development budget of the United States government. So we see at the beginning the beginning, space dominates non-defense spending. At the end, health dominates R&D. In the middle, in the late 70s, there is a period where energy is pretty much equivalent with health, even a little larger than health, and competitive with space. But that didn't last very long. But a lot of that R&D still paid off. It didn't totally go away. Comes back a little bit with the stimulus package in 2009, 2010. So that created a base for solar, but in and of itself, it did not bring about what Carter wanted. Here's what played a bigger role, or at least a complementary role, and that was state renewable portfolio standards. The idea started in Iowa, where they had a lot of wind. Texas was one of the first major adopters. And this shows that most states in the United States, some of them blue states, some of them red states, have renewable portfolio standards. And this is a fairly up-to-date graph. It's the latest one published, but it's already out of date because states are getting larger goals. And in states in the middle of the country where they have a lot of wind resources, wind is booming. Elsewhere in the country, solar is booming. So we had a place where the federal government came very close to passing a renewable portfolio standard, never did, but the states did. So this has driven a lot of it. Also, I have to give Germany some credit. Germany's taken a lot of abuse because everybody said, well, they spent all this money encouraging solar, and we're not paying as much as they did. Well, whoever leads the market will probably pay more, but there's a learning curve. So we benefit from some of the early experiences in Germany, and we should be grateful for that. So now in this new age that we live in, this is just a simple line graph, and it is a zero-based line graph, unlike many line graphs that you see. So the drama of this line is real, and these are basically utility-sized solar farms. And you can see they go from almost zero in 2010 to now they're taking off, and that line is going to continue to grow at a very rapid pace. And then just a little news clip, anecdotal evidence. In Texas, this one site is headed towards 1 gigawatt solar farm. So that's where we are in that. Now, this hasn't been built yet, but it's been announced. I'm pretty sure it will be built. So there we are. And this is a happy President Carter. He turns 95 this year. This happens to be when he was 92. And he asked me to come over for the dedication of a solar farm on his peanut land and give a little talk about the history of solar energy, because he knew I still remembered the 1979 dedication. And I think my wife took this picture. But you see in the background a farm, 10 acres of photovoltaic panels that are programmed to track the sun during the day. So this is the sort of the modern technology that we're dealing with. One of the reporters asked him, did he feel vindicated now, all these years later, that solar was taking off, and he's too modest, and so he said, well, I can't say that, but I'm sure he did feel vindicated. Now, one point that I'd like to make is that R&D is very necessary for technological change, but it's not sufficient. We must consider markets and private investment. For something really big, the private sector needs the government, and for something, for market penetration, the government needs the private sector. So whoever here is working on partnerships, those are very good things. Now, I'm going to give another example. Some people will come and talk to you about solar. Some people will come and talk to you about fracking. I'll talk to you about both of them. In the 1970s, we believed we were running out of natural gas. We even passed laws that said that you could not use natural gas in a new electric generation plant, and the law anticipated we would phase out the use of gas in existing plants. The idea was it was so scarce that we would save it for direct home use. And so you see here, the top line is consumption. So where the consumption is higher than production, we're basically importing the gas from Canada. And you can see that production sort of stagnates, kind of hangs in there, and then it started its own boom, and you saw the number for that previously. So what happened? Well, in the 1970s, we had incentives for what was called oil in tight formations. And you have to be careful when you're studying fracturing, because a lot of technical people call it tight formations. The general public calls it shale. They're basically talking about the same thing. So they put in tax incentives to develop unconventional oil. There was a lot of R&D work on drill bits and seismology. And a fellow named George Mitchell in Texas, outside of Dallas, bought a big chunk of land that had no value unless you could frack it. And he spent decades working to develop hydrofracturing, where you would pump at high pressure water with some chemicals in it, break up the shale, and extract the oil. And but it would take a long time. A lot like solar, he had to have patience. So what's happening here? This is probably history most of you wouldn't be familiar with, but I mentioned the Fuel Use Act. It was repealed in 1987. We finally got total rid of natural gas price controls in '89. The industry developed, with the help of the government, developed advanced combined cycle power plants. And environmental regulations were making it more challenging for coal producers. I would argue if we hadn't repealed the Fuel Use Act, we never would have heard of George Mitchell, because he could have done every engineering trick he had up his sleeve to produce that gas. But if there wasn't a market for it, the private sector had no incentive to tweak the system. And indeed, they tweaked it with horizontal drilling and all sorts of things that have made that a big deal. Now, I'm going to make a personal reference here. When I was head of EIA, I testified before Congress, I think, 25 times. And when they found out I was leaving, they said, well, we need to have another hearing so we could say goodbye. Do you have a topic? And I said, well, if you want to raise a ruckus, let me talk about natural gas. So this was the graph that I used in that testimony. Now, this is back in the spring of 2000. And basically so we are basically here on natural gas. And what I predicted, and EI predicted, was there was going to be this sudden explosion of use of natural gas for electric generation. It wasn't showing up in the data, but it was based on our analysis that the new combined cycle advanced natural gas plants were so efficient, they were so cheap, they could be built more quickly, and they had lower maintenance, that the industry was going to turn to this over coal. We took a beating on that. Even the natural gas industry was quite upset with that. But we were right. But I can't brag too much, because I'm trying to make a point here. We did not predict that natural gas prices would come down the way they did. We predicted a price for natural gas that's about 4 times what the current price of gas is, but we still got this trend line right. Why did we get it right? Because we were looking at the holistic picture, not only of how they would produce the gas, but how they were going to use it and where was it most efficient. So it takes the aligning of many factors to make things happen in energy. And I think it's fair to say I've just picked 2 examples, and they give us a chance to see how change happens, and I could give other examples, many technologies you all are working on. I'm going to close. I was going to give a little talk on transportation here, but this is the driving miles, which is soaring in the United States. It's the major obstacle to dealing with climate change today. Obviously, we've got to electrify our vehicles. But I'm going to close with a story, because I like stories. I spent a lot of time in presidential libraries going over what they were talking about at the time. And in 1974, President Gerald Ford gave a speech, and he announced that we were spending more on energy research and development than we spent either on the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb or the Apollo project to send somebody to the moon. And when he got back, he assigned a staff member to check whether this was in fact true. Probably should have done it the other way around. But it came back with the good news. The staffer he asked to look into it, Mike Duvall, reported back that the government spending on research and development was just about to exceed that for the atomic bomb or the moon landing. But Duvall suggested to the president that the administration might be comparing apples and oranges, since unlike space and defense, the private sector would be the main customer for new energy technology. In the case of space and defense, the main user, of course, was the government itself. I won't say that price was no object, but it's a little different than selling something in the market. So Duvall's observation is still relevant today. Basing an energy program on the model of the Manhattan or Apollo projects, as 2 of our major bills before Congress today are doing, is not good enough. Sending a person to the moon is relatively easy compared to realigning a whole energy system. My conclusion is that energy and dealing with climate change is bigger than the Manhattan Project. It's bigger than the Apollo project. We can solve our problems, but not all at once. There's no silver bullet, but there's a lot of silver buckshot. So with that mixture of optimism and pessimism, I hope we have time for plenty of questions.
So, Jay, thank you very much. We're using an app called Slido. So you go onto the app called slido.com, you put it in your subject line, and then you can type in a question. But a couple of questions have come in. One of them, obviously, is a bigger question. But given your perspective and all that you know, how do you feel about the Green New Deal?
Well, the Green New Deal is in the news every day, which is good. I mean, when we go back to the presidential debates, of all the presidential debates, there was one question on climate change. That suggests to me that our attention span is not always focused in the right place. So in terms of focusing our attention, I think it has been of some help. I think in certain respects, it confuses things, because when you say that we could go to zero carbon in 10 years, I couldn't find you a single person that could make a case that that's possible. Also, there's no content to it at this point, and they're saying that, well, we'll have a plan ready next year. Well, if it's urgent, why isn't the plan ready today? So my approach to this, and some members of Congress agree with me, is you, at any point in time, you can do what you do that week, or you do what you can do that year. If the political environment changes, you do what you can do in that environment. But you have to remember that in the political process, I started as a political science professor. I started in the world of academia. And if there was one thing I wanted to teach students, it's that it takes 60 votes to cut off a filibuster in the United States Senate. That's the political system that we deal with. So the idea that there's some grand scheme that's going to come in all at once, I think is a false goal. So what I urge people is look for bits and pieces. I think the push for renewable energy is something that everybody's for. As I showed, a wide variety of states support that. Push that. Push the kind of regulations that will lead us to the electrified vehicle system. I think I could put together a coalition for that idea, and do the parts of it that are big enough to make a difference, but small enough to get passed. It's going to be a continual battle. It's not, as some say, that there's a particular temperature. For years, the science community was telling us everything up to 2 degrees Celsius is okay. It's only in the last year that the main scientific studies have said, well, 1.5 degrees Celsius. And 2 degrees Celsius is what, 3.6 Fahrenheit? So Americans are seeing that, and is 3.6 Fahrenheit okay? Probably not. But is 2 degrees the end of the world? No, it's not. So you keep finding that increment that you can do something about at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and don't turn down something because it doesn't solve all your problems all at once.
Another question's come in. So what will be the role of transportation electrification? And will it make the energy problem easier or more difficult to solve?
Electrification is generally a good thing. I mean, it depends a little bit on what the nature of the grid is. The Union of Concerned Scientists regularly updates their information to tell them, you tell them what utility you have, and they'll tell you how good it is to drive an electric vehicle. But I do have to give a shout out here to Professor Viswanathan. I don't know if he's here, but he's at the university, and he's one of the nation's leading experts in batteries. And he's even looking ahead on whether batteries can be used for short airplane flights, which is pretty avant-garde at this point. But the electric vehicle is just by its nature more efficient. And then if it's using a grid that we can turn to nuclear, solar, and wind, and it's a good pairing with wind, because if you're recharging at home, there's a lot of excess wind power at night. So it's almost like the electricity is free. So the electric car is really the way to go. Some people argue hydrogen fuel cells. I'm not convinced by that. And we're on the way. I mean, Volkswagen just announced this last week, massive capital spending to produce new electric vehicles. So I think we do have to remember that in non-urban environments, the ranking Republican on the Appropriations Committee, energy part of it, is from Idaho. And he says, look, I drive for 400 miles a day. So it needs a little more work to be relevant in Idaho, but for urban environments, it's definitely the way to go. And then if you have ride sharing or people who put in big miles like your taxis or Lyft or Uber, it pays off financially. So I was a little bit, in my book, I was sort of like, electric cars are probably what we need. I talked to some of the people at the labs and I wasn't totally convinced. Today I'm totally convinced that if you want to keep energy policy simple, you put as much of the generation under no carbon, and then you run your vehicles off of it. Now you still have to deal with agriculture and cement production and things like that, but.
All right, so we have lots of questions coming in, but we have time for one more. So which new technology excites you the most?
Well, I'll just say I love automobiles, so I'd say the electric car. But I think the strategically most important technology is batteries, because batteries affect vehicles. The big batteries can be used to adopt more wider use of wind and solar, which are intermittent. So if you want to use it intermittent, now batteries aren't the only way to store energy. I mean, you can use pumped hydro, you can use a lot of things. But I think if you want to launch the one technology that's going to change things, and again, I feel confident the batteries are going to change things. I feel confident we will be driving electric vehicles, but we should never forget that carbon stays in the atmosphere for over a century. It's unlike any other environmental issue that we deal with. So it makes a big difference whether we get to electric vehicles in 10 years or we get to them in 30 years. So what we're trying to do is accelerate the pace of these things so that we're doing it in a serious manner with the challenges that we face.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jay.
Okay.